The folder sat on Pauline Hatch's desk like something she had already decided not to open. She had not touched it, not even glanced at the cover page, where I had typed in block capitals, formal safety concern, medication discrepancy, urgent review required. It sat to her right, slightly skewed, the way you leave a letter you have already decided to ignore. Beverly Crane stood at her shoulder. Senior Nurse Manager, Ward 7, Thornfield General Hospital, West Yorkshire. Arms folded. Chin raised. The expression on her face was not quite a smirk, but it carried the same information. I sat down in the chair opposite. Because I am the kind of person who sits down. My name is Petra Wills. Registered staff nurse. 9 years of clinical experience, the last 4 at Thornfield General. I document carefully. I follow procedure. I hold, perhaps stubbornly, to one belief: hospitals exist to protect patients. That belief, I was about to learn, had made me a liability. Maybe focus on your own work, Pauline said. She lifted the stamp and pressed it down without reading a single word. Unfounded. Red ink on white paper. Clean, rehearsed, and utterly without shame. My chest tightened, not only from anger, though anger was there. From something colder and slower. Fear. Because I knew exactly what I had documented. And I knew, with the certainty that settles in the stomach rather than the head, that someone on that ward was going to die if it stayed buried. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button if you have not already, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I read every single one. Now, back to the story, because it is only just beginning. I did not even reach the end of the corridor. Beverly Crane had stepped out of the HR office before me and moved ahead at a pace. By the time I turned the corner onto the ward, she was already standing near the entrance, voice raised just enough to carry. Some people here, she said, to no one in particular and everyone within earshot, simply do not understand how protocol works. The ward fell quiet. 2 student nurses near the medication trolley stopped moving. A healthcare assistant at the far end looked up, then quickly away. A nurse I had worked alongside for 3 years found a sudden interest in the supply board. Nobody spoke. By the afternoon, my access to certain patient records had been quietly revoked. No notification, no written instruction. I opened the system to complete a routine risk log entry and found 3 files I had been cross-referencing for weeks returning a single message: access restricted, contact your line manager. Beverly Crane was my line manager. I sat for a moment at the terminal, very still. No formal disciplinary process had been initiated. No instruction had been issued in writing. Nothing I could point to would constitute evidence of a deliberate act, because it had been carefully designed that way. I was not being removed. I was being erased. Methodically, patiently, with just enough deniability that every individual step appeared entirely reasonable. The distinction, I was beginning to understand, was the entire point. 2 days after the dismissal, I returned to Ward 7 and something stopped me before I reached the nurse's station. A patient file had been left open on the terminal near Bay 3. Whether by carelessness or oversight, I could not say. It belonged to a Mr. Ashford, 63 years old, admitted 4 days earlier following a suspected cardiac event. I had reviewed his medication record the previous week and remembered it clearly. What I was looking at was not the same record. The evening medication entry bore a timestamp of 1942. I knew with certainty, because I had been present on that ward at that hour, that no medication had been administered at that time. The nurse responsible had been managing an emergency 3 bays down. I had been there. I had watched. Someone had added the entry retrospectively. The dosage had also changed. Quietly, within a range that might not immediately raise concern, but changed nonetheless. The original record, which I had photographed before submitting my complaint, had shown a discrepancy I had flagged in writing. Now it showed something smooth and untroubled. Someone was rewriting history. Calmly. With access. With the confidence of a person who does not expect to be found out. I did not react. Did not speak. Did not allow my expression to shift. I closed the screen, walked to the staff bathroom, locked the door, and stood at the basin for a very long time. My complaint had been about exactly this. I began checking systematically that evening, after my shift. I had retained legitimate copies of records I was professionally involved with over the preceding 4 months, entries I had co-signed, risk assessments I had contributed to, and medication logs from patients on my assigned bays. I laid them across my kitchen table in chronological order and began from the beginning. It took less than 2 hours to see it clearly. Incorrect dosages were corrected quietly after the fact, late entries logged at timestamps that corresponded to no active staff presence on the ward. Signatures added without the accompanying handover documentation. Risk flags not removed, but softened, downgraded just enough that a quick review found nothing alarming, while the genuine concern was buried underneath. Not one case. Not 2. Dozens. Spread across 4 months of records, across 11 patients, across at least 3 medication categories. Each individual instance, in isolation, carried a plausible explanation. A transcription error. A system delay. An administrative correction was logged retrospectively. But laid end to end across my kitchen table, they did not look like errors. They looked like a system. Deliberate, low profile, and sustained. Not a single patient death had been formally attributed to these records. Not yet. But the gaps were real, the risk was documented, and the pattern was unmistakable once you had all of it in front of you at once. I photographed every page. I made 2 sets of copies. I stored one set at my sister's address across the city. Then I sat down, ate my dinner, and thought carefully about what had to come next. I was going to need complete steadiness for it. I found it on a Tuesday. I arrived for a morning shift and went to my locker in the staff changing room at 6:47. I know the time because I checked my telephone immediately before opening the door. The locker was not locked. Not forced, not broken. Just slightly ajar, as though someone had pulled it shut without quite catching the latch. Inside, on top of my folded scrubs, was a single sheet of A4 paper. The front page of my original formal complaint, the one Pauline Hatch had stamped unfounded on the morning of its submission. Someone had either retained a copy or printed a fresh one. It had been torn cleanly along the center crease and both halves placed back in the locker with a neatness that felt entirely deliberate. No note. No name. No explanation. Just the torn paper. I stood looking at it for what felt like much longer than it probably was. My locker had a 4-digit combination I had set myself on my first week at Thornfield and never shared with anyone. Staff guidance explicitly stated that combinations must not be disclosed to managers or colleagues. Either someone had watched me enter it on a separate occasion, or someone had access to the staff combination register held by the facilities. I folded both halves and placed them carefully in the inside pocket of my bag. Then I changed into my scrubs, clipped on my badge, and walked out to the ward. The message required no translation whatsoever. Stop digging. 3 weeks after the locker incident, a patient on Bay 4 went into acute respiratory distress at 2:20 in the afternoon. Her name was Mrs. Hartley. 71 years old, post-operative, mild cardiac history. Nothing in her presentation that morning to suggest crisis. I was near the end of the bay when her monitor alarmed, and I moved with the team that responded. In the seconds it took to reach her bedside, I had already run her listed medications through my memory. I had checked her chart that morning during handover. I knew what she was prescribed. But as the registrar called for her most recent drug chart, something snagged in my mind, the quiet, specific unease of recognizing that something does not match. The anticoagulant listed on the board was not what I had seen that morning. The dosage had changed. Not dramatically. Subtly, in the way every alteration in these records had always been subtle. I spoke. That dosage on the board does not match the chart I reviewed this morning. The temperature of the room dropped several degrees. Beverly Crane appeared from the corridor. Stick to your role, Petra, she said. Perfectly level. The registrar looked at me once. Then at Beverly. He proceeded with the dose on the board. Mrs. Hartley stabilized, eventually, after 40 minutes that should not have been necessary. Afterwards, I stood alone in the corridor and understood clearly, this was no longer about policy. This was about harm. I did not sleep that night. I lay in the dark, going over the same timestamps and names until my flat felt very small and very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. At 3:30 in the morning, I gave up, went to the kitchen, made tea, and pulled a box file from beneath my bed. Inside were my employment contract, my staff handbook, and procedural documents from my induction 4 years earlier. I had not opened them in months. I started at the beginning and read carefully. 40 minutes later, I found it. Section 14, subsection 3. Half a page into a paragraph about internal escalation procedures, written in the compressed language that is not accidental and not designed to be read quickly. Where a formal safety complaint is received and deemed unresolved by internal review, or where the responsible authority fails to act within 20 working days of submission, the staff member is both entitled and required to escalate the matter to the relevant external regulatory oversight body. Entitled and required. I read it 3 more times. Pauline Hatch had stamped my complaint unfounded on the day I submitted it. Not 20 working days later. The same morning. She had not conducted a review. She had not followed the very procedure her department was obligated to uphold. She had not merely dismissed me. She had violated the protocol her office existed to enforce. I set the handbook down and wrapped both hands around my mug. Everything had just changed. I did not act immediately. Acting immediately would have been a mistake. Instead, I spent the following 9 days constructing what I had begun calling the archive privately. I worked in the evenings at my kitchen table, using only records I was legitimately entitled to retain, documents I had co-signed, entries I had contributed to, correspondence I had sent or received professionally. I made no copies of anything I did not have the right to hold. I took nothing that was not already mine. What I built from those materials, however, was something else entirely. A timeline. 47 separate entries spanning 4 months, across 11 patients and 3 medication categories. Each entry is cross-referenced against shift rotas, handover logs, and incident reports. Each discrepancy is annotated in a separate column: original record, altered record, date of alteration, and staff on ward during the relevant shift. I added a dedicated section for Mrs. Hartley. Timestamp, detailed. Including a written account of the exchange with Beverly Crane, and the name of every person present in Bay 4 at the time. I printed the archive in triplicate. 1 copy went in a sealed envelope to my solicitor, with instructions to open it only if I made contact requesting it, or upon any adverse change to my employment status. 1 copy went to my sister. 1 copy remained with me. The digital version was backed up to 2 separate cloud accounts under different credentials. The picture was no longer uncertain. It was precise, sequenced, and entirely evidenced. I was ready. I returned to Human Resources on a Thursday morning, 12 days after completing the archive. I had made a formal appointment through the hospital's internal booking system and confirmed it by email, generating a time-stamped written record. I brought a printed copy of the archive index, not the full document, just the structured summary, clipped inside a fresh folder with a typed cover letter citing Section 14, subsection 3 of the staff handbook by name and number. Pauline Hatch was alone this time. No, Beverly Crane. I placed the folder on the desk. She did not reach for it. I am submitting a second formal complaint, I said, supported by documented evidence citing specific medication discrepancies across 11 patients over 4 months. I am also citing a procedural breach under Section 14, subsection 3 of the staff handbook, as my original complaint was dismissed without review on the day of submission. Pauline looked at me steadily for a moment. Your behavior is becoming disruptive, Petra. She did not ask to see the folder. Did not open it. Instead, she reached into the desk drawer and removed a single sheet of paper, already printed, already dated. Formal written warning: conduct, disruptive and challenging behavior in the workplace. My name is at the top. Her signature at the bottom. It had been prepared before I walked in. I picked it up, read it once, and placed it in my bag alongside the folder. "I note receipt of this," I said quietly. "Thank you for your time." The weeks that followed felt like being slowly turned down. My shift pattern changed without consultation. I found the revised rota posted on the board one Tuesday morning, my name redistributed across a sequence of low-visibility positions, overnight cover, bank holiday fills. The kind of pattern that removes a person from the functioning center of a department without ever formally saying so. My patient allocation was reduced. There was always a reason offered: staffing numbers, bay reconfiguration, student supervision requirements. But the cumulative effect was unmistakable. I was being moved to the margins. Colleagues I had worked alongside for 4 years became careful around me. Not unkind, I want to be precise about this, but careful. The kind of care that comes from fear rather than dislike. A ward clerk named Trish, who had always been warm at the nurse's station, began finding reasons to be busy when I arrived. A healthcare assistant I had personally trained 2 years earlier started taking breaks in the opposite staff room. Nobody told them to behave this way. They did not need to be told. The atmosphere communicated what was expected with a precision no written instruction could have managed. Keep your distance. Do not be associated. Do not become involved. I watched it happen and I did not try to reverse it. I understood exactly what it was: isolation as institutional policy, enacted through atmosphere rather than instruction. You cannot appeal against a feeling. You cannot file a grievance against the way a room goes quiet when you enter. But I was not done. Not remotely. On a quiet Wednesday evening in the 3rd week of November, I sat at my kitchen table and opened my laptop. I had visited the page before, in the way you visit a destination you are not yet certain you are ready for. The Care Quality Commission's secure online portal. The section designated for serious incident reporting by healthcare professionals. Protected submission, meaning my identity would be withheld from the organization under review unless the formal investigation required disclosure, and even then, only under the full safeguards the statutory framework provided. I had read the guidance 3 times over the preceding month and noted the categories of reportable concern, the evidentiary standards required, and the timelines governing formal regulatory review. My archive met every single threshold. I opened a new submission and began from the top. Organization: Thornfield General Hospital NHS Foundation Trust. Nature of concern: systematic falsification of medication administration records. Ongoing patient safety risk. Internal complaint dismissed without procedural review. The second formal complaint resulted in a written warning for conduct. I attached the archive index, the annotated timeline, the email confirming my second HR appointment, and a copy of the formal written warning issued in direct response to my documented safety concern. Mrs. Hartley's case was listed separately, with its own timeline and supporting notes. At the bottom of the form, a single tick box. I confirmed the information submitted is accurate and given in good faith. I moved the cursor to the submit button. I sat. I thought of Mrs. Hartley. Of 40 minutes that had not needed to happen. I pressed submit. The confirmation arrived 4 minutes later. Reference: CQC-TGH 2024-4471. Your submission has been received and is under initial assessment. You will be contacted within 10 working days. I read it twice. I copied the reference number into a dedicated document, noted the timestamp, and closed the laptop. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because it was not triumph. What I felt was closer to the sensation at the end of a very long, difficult piece of work, the feeling of having carried something heavy for months and finally being permitted to set it down. I had not exaggerated a single entry, had not added interpretation where only facts belonged. Had not reached beyond what the records themselves demonstrated. I had documented names, dates, medication records, system access logs, shift rotas, and the precise sequence of 2 internal complaints, both dismissed, one by stamp, one by formal written warning. I had included Mrs. Hartley's case in full detail. I had cited Section 14, Subsection 3, by chapter and verse. I had not accused. I had not inflated. I had simply documented. And now, somewhere in a regulatory office with genuine statutory authority and no institutional reason whatsoever to protect Thornfield General NHS Foundation Trust, someone was going to read every single page. I made a pot of tea, sat on my sofa in the quiet of my flat, and for the first time in several months, I was asleep well before midnight. The first sign came 8 days after submitting the report. I arrived for an early shift, and at 7:53 the hospital's patient records system went offline across the entire site. No prior maintenance notice had appeared on the staff intranet. No email had been circulated. Just a holding message: scheduled maintenance, services temporarily unavailable. Please contact your line manager. Nobody had been told about scheduled maintenance. By 10 o'clock, 3 members of the Information Technology Department were on the ward with laptops and access cards. They spoke quietly to one another and to nobody else. They were not running an upgrade. They were running an audit, pulling system access logs, reviewing login timestamps, cross-referencing terminal activity against staff rotas. I recognized the difference. In the afternoon, Beverly Crane arrived for a shift she was not rostered to cover. She checked the patient board, said almost nothing, and stood near the medication room for a long time with the expression of someone processing information they do not yet know how to manage. At 4 o'clock, an emergency management meeting was convened for the senior nursing team. No agenda circulated, just a room number and a time on the internal board. I was not invited. That evening, Pauline Hatch sent an all-staff email reminding everyone of the data protection policy and the correct procedures for handling sensitive documentation. 3 careful paragraphs saying nothing specific. She sent it at 7:22 in the evening, on a day when the records system had been audited without any prior warning. Something had most certainly started. They arrived on a Monday. I had not been informed in advance and had not expected to be. I came onto the ward at 7:30 for a morning shift and noticed 2 people I did not recognize standing near the entrance to the ward manager's office. Both wore plain, professional clothing. Neither carried a Thornfield General lanyard. They were speaking to the ward administrator and working from a printed list. The questions they were asking were specific. Not the kind that come from a general inspection or routine annual visit. The kind that comes from people who have already read a detailed document and need the written evidence confirmed against physical reality. They asked about the process for logging retrospective corrections to medication records. They asked to review the administration records for Bay 4 across a 4-month window. They asked one of the Band 5 nurses, conversationally, as though merely curious, how handover documentation was recorded and whether hard copies were retained after digital entry. They already knew exactly where to look. That was the detail that told me the most. When investigators arrive already knowing which drawer to open, it means they came equipped with a map. Maps come from evidence submitted in advance. My archive index ran to 17 pages. I carried on with my shift and said nothing to anyone. But the ward that morning had a different quality to it, watchful, held, as though everyone present could sense the ground beginning to shift beneath the building. The records did not hold. I learned this in fragments, the way most significant information moves through a hospital, in overheard conversation, in the body language of people in corridors, in the particular way silence distributes itself around a truth that has not yet been formally stated. The investigators had pulled medication administration records for all 11 patients I had cross-referenced in the archive. They had also obtained the system access logs, the digital record of not what had been entered into patient files, but when, from which terminal, and under whose login credentials. These 2 sets of data did not align. Entries appearing in patient records at certain timestamps corresponded to no active login session during those windows. Retrospective corrections had been processed under credentials belonging to staff members not present on the ward at the relevant hour. In 3 separate cases, the access logs showed records being modified from a terminal in the ward manager's office, outside clinical hours, after the corresponding shift had closed. The alterations I had documented were not theoretical. They were now evidenced in the system's own architecture. This is what careful record-keeping does. Not only does it document irregularities, It creates the conditions in which a system becomes its own witness. The records that had been quietly amended for months contained, within their own data structure, the precise proof of what had been done to them. What had been hidden was not destroyed. It had been waiting for someone with the authority and the patience to look. Executive vehicles began appearing in the hospital car park before 8 in the morning. Over 3 consecutive days, a Tuesday, a Wednesday, and a Thursday, I noticed dark saloon cars occupying the senior leadership spaces at hours they were not usually taken. The kind of presence that means someone further up the chain has been made aware and has decided their attendance is now necessary. The boardroom on the 3rd floor had its blinds drawn across 2 full afternoons. Voices audible through the glass rose and sharpened and then went quiet again, in the rhythm of a room where people are not managing a situation but negotiating the terms of a crisis they did not see coming. An internal voicemail appeared in my work inbox from an unrecognized number, requesting a meeting at my earliest convenience to discuss recent communications with the organization. Formal in tone, careful in language, empty of specific detail. I did not return it. Then Pauline Hatch sent an email. Subject: Your previous formal complaint, review. We would like to arrange a meeting to revisit the concerns you raised earlier in the year. We believe there may be value in discussing the matter informally before any formal process is initiated. I read it 3 times. Before any formal process is initiated. The formal process had already been initiated. By a statutory body with investigative powers. Weeks ago. Acting on a submission that was logged, referenced, and in active review. They were scrambling. And it was far too late for informal. Pauline Hatch called the meeting for a Friday afternoon. The same glass-partitioned office. The same desk. The same faint scent of the reed diffuser on the windowsill. But nothing else about the atmosphere was the same. There was no stamp waiting. No pre-printed folder. Pauline was sitting forward in her chair with the posture of someone who had been told, recently and firmly, to be careful. She asked me to sit down. I sat. We want to be clear, she began, that the hospital takes all patient safety concerns with the utmost seriousness. I said nothing. We also want to acknowledge that the process around your initial submission may not have been handled with the thoroughness it deserved. I said nothing. She paused, selecting her next words from a list that was clearly proving inadequate for the situation she now found herself in. Why did you not come back to us, she said. Before escalating externally. Why not give the organization an opportunity to address this through internal channels first? I reached into my bag. I placed on the desk the original folder, the one she had stamped unfounded on the morning of its submission, without opening it, without reading a single line. Beside it, I placed the email confirming my second formal HR appointment. Beside that, the formal written warning issued in direct response to the evidence I had brought to that meeting. I set all 3 down without comment. The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was a record. I said. Beverly Crane was removed from Ward 7 on a Wednesday morning. No announcement. No farewell collection, no speech. She simply did not appear for her shift, and by midday her name had been removed from the rota board. By afternoon, the ward manager's door bore a notice about a temporary operational reorganization. The language was empty of detail. But absence, in a hospital, communicates everything that language withholds. 2 further members of staff were placed on administrative leave over the following fortnight. I knew them both by sight. One had appeared in my archive, her login credentials present in the system access logs during hours she had not been rostered to the ward. I learned of these developments the way I had learned most things across the preceding months, not through direct communication to me, but through the visible change in rotas, the quiet redistribution of responsibilities, the particular manner in which a structure begins to dismantle itself once the foundation has been removed. The investigation was ongoing. No public announcement had been made. The Care Quality Commission does not work on press releases at the investigative stage. It works in evidence, in formal findings, and ultimately in reports. The report was progressing. I knew this through reference correspondence received at intervals, formal updates that said little but confirmed the process continued. The system that had dismissed my complaint, isolated me, and issued a formal written warning for the act of returning with evidence had begun, layer by layer, to dismantle itself beneath the weight of its own record. The letter arrived on a Monday. It came from the lead investigator assigned to reference CQC-TGH 2024-4471. Addressed to me by name, printed on headed paper, formal in tone. It asked whether I would be willing to participate in the ongoing regulatory review of Thornfield General Hospital NHS Foundation Trust in the capacity of a compliance witness. Not as a complainant, not as a subject of investigation. As a witness. I read it at my kitchen table with the second cup of tea of the morning and sat for a long time before responding. I thought about the months that had produced this letter. The unfounded stamp. The locker. Mrs. Hartley and the 40 minutes that had not been necessary. The formal written warning was issued the morning I returned with documentation. The shift changes. The silence that had replaced ordinary conversation was communicated through the atmosphere of the ward rather than any spoken instruction. I thought about the sealed envelope at my solicitor's office. The 17-page archive index. The Wednesday evening in November when I had moved the cursor to the submit button. I confirmed my willingness to act as a compliance witness. The first formal session took place 12 days later, in a neutral meeting room in a regulatory office building 30 minutes outside the city, not the hospital, not my flat. The same two professionals who had walked Ward 7 in plain clothing, asking questions from a printed list, were present. They asked me about the archive. I had brought every page of it. I am sitting in a different office now. Same hospital. Different floor. Different function. The desk is smaller and the window overlooks the car park, but there is a window, a proper one, not the borrowed strip of light I used to share with a corridor and two filing cabinets. Outside, the trees at the edge of the grounds are beginning to turn. It has been almost 11 months since Pauline Hatch pressed a stamp down on a folder she had not opened. The formal investigation concluded in the spring. Beverly Crane did not return to clinical practice in any registered capacity. 2 other members of staff received formal regulatory notices. The hospital's board underwent a mandatory governance review, overseen externally, with a published action plan and a properly credentialed compliance officer, genuinely appointed this time. I was not reinstated into my original post. I was offered something that had not previously existed. Safeguarding and Compliance Liaison, Ward 7 and adjacent areas, created as a direct recommendation of the investigation's findings, which meant Pauline Hatch's stamp had produced the very role it was designed to prevent. I thought about that for a long time before accepting. Then I thought about Mrs. Hartley. About the locker. About 40 minutes that were not necessary. I accepted. 3 days into the new post, a newly qualified nurse knocked on my door. Printed form in hand. That particular look, not uncertainty about what she had seen, but about whether anyone would listen. I asked her to sit down. I closed the door, and I listened to every single word. Every report deserves to be heard. Thank you for staying with this story to the very end. If it moved you, if any part felt familiar, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment below. Have you ever raised a concern and been dismissed? Have you ever worked alongside a Beverly Crane? This channel exists because of you. See you in the next one.